Okay, hello and welcome. For those listening on YouTube, this is a deep dive Thursday from Code Mentoring. Today we're going to be exploring and looking further into the CSS Grid. It's a really awesome technology that I use a lot every day in building out UIs. We're going to be talking about how we use it, when we use it, and why we use it over something like Flexbox, what are the pros and cons of each. And then I'm actually going to run through a couple of little examples as a code along today. And I'll be posting all this code up on GitHub once this recording is done as well, so you guys don't need to worry about, oh my god, I couldn't finish it in time. Don't worry, that'll all be shared for you and for those on YouTube as well. So let's get started. I encourage all of you guys to bring out your code editor. Hopefully it's not Notepad. And we'll get started. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. All right. You guys can see this okay? Yep, awesome. I can't hear you, so if you guys need to talk, definitely turn on the mic and say hello. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create an entirely new folder. I'm going to go into my code mentoring, go into webinars, somewhere here. It's fine, I'll just create a new folder. I'll call this CSS Grid. Now open that up. Zoom in a little bit for those who can't see. All right, I'm just going to create a first little index.html file. And you guys can see this okay? This is readable for you?
I can see it okay.
Excellent. So let's go ahead. I'm just going to, for those who don't know about this shortcut, I'm going to press the exclamation mark. Now, if your syntax is set to HTML, you just press tab. It will actually auto-complete this for you. So you don't have to worry about writing all this stuff. It's nice and easy. I'm going to tab through this stuff, CSS Grid demo. All right, we're going to do a couple of these things. So I'll load this up in the browser. Okay, H1. Oh, my shortcuts seem to have been disabled. Give me a second. I just installed this new plugin, so I'm just going to disable it. I think it's broken my HTML autocomplete, which you don't want. Nope, that's just broken in general. Okay. All good. We're doing it the manual way. So what is CSS Grid used for? Right? What's a practical application of CSS Grid? Does anybody know? As we start to explore this idea today.
Like
Layout?
calculator?
Layout? What did you say, Tomoyo?
Calculator?
A code creator?
Calculator.
Oh, calculator. Yeah. So we could have like a yeah. Let's start with that as a simple example. Actually, the calculator was the first exercise I used to give people in code mentoring. So for nostalgia's sake, let's jump into it. So let's just say we have a wrapper, call it calculator. Calculator. Right. Then let's say we have a bunch of numbers. So let's say 10 numbers. Right, and each side this. Now, for those who are not familiar with what I'm doing, I'm using a feature in VS Code called emmet, abbreviation. So I can just press this and press tab, and it will automatically fill these out for me, which is pretty cool. I'm going to remove this, add a 0. Right. Okay, so a calculator doesn't look like this, does it? All right. We actually have a calculator. Mac app, we do. So this will kind of be like our reference. Right. Thanks for joining us, Crispy Chicken. Good to see you, Jeff. So we've got this grid layout here, right? It's about what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 by 4, right? So how do we, this is a very basic example of a grid in that pretty much all of the buttons are of the same width and height. There's only one example here that takes up multiple columns. So in this case, this is a pretty basic example of the grid. So how do we go from this format over here, where they're all in a straight line, to sitting like this? Well, this is where the CSS Grid steps in. Okay, so I'm going to create a style tag like this. I'm going to select the calculator like that. Now, how do we actually turn this into a grid? Does anybody know? What property do we use?
Display.
Display. So display grid. Now, before I refresh the page, any guesses on what this is going to do? What's the default grid look like? Anybody know? All right. Do we think it's going to stay the same, horizontal? Or do we think it's going to be vertical? Or is it going to be a combination? Let's have a look. Boom. So a couple of things have gone on here, right? It's taken everything we had before, right? Let me just refresh this and then open up in a new tab so you guys can see the difference. This is what we had before, right? So what do we notice here, team? What's different about this? Obviously, it's vertical, right? But how much space is it now taking up? Anybody know why this is the case?
It's taking up the full width of the screen.
Yeah. Why is that?
We need to assign a row. We need to assign a in a.
Yeah, we could assign rows, but I'm curious as to why it's decided to take up the entire thing.
I think it's changed from inline to block.
That's correct. That was an excellent answer, because that is exactly what's happened. A grid, by default, is display block, even though it's display grid. So it's actually a combination of elements. Does anybody know how to not get this effect? Well, we can actually set this to inline grid. And there you go. So inline grid, as the name suggests, is a combination of grid, but also display inline block. So that allows for this format. Whereas by default, right, grid is just going to take you all the way out. It's the greedy. We actually have a deep dive, or there's a CSS talk somewhere. I think it might be Beginner Wednesday on YouTube, talking about the display property. If you guys want to look into that more, I'd go and check that out there. Yeah, so how do we go from this, right, to this grid format? All right, hey Marcos, thanks for joining us. So this is where we start to mess around with some of the properties inside grid. Now, if you have a look into CSS Grid properties and say MDN, right, you'll start to see all of the different options there are for the CSS Grid. Right, we got like all sorts of complex stuff here. I didn't even know about this one. This is a short code for all this stuff. Now, if you're coming to Grid for the first time, and you look at this stuff, and you're going to go, holy moly! Right, look at all of these different properties. Right, all these different configurations. There's heaps of different blog posts on this stuff. It becomes very confusing as a beginner first starting out. So what I'm going to try and do for you guys today is reduce all of this complexity, and let's look at some really base examples and slowly start to build up our knowledge base of how these things work together. Sound good for you guys? So what's the first thing that we should probably play with? Well, somebody mentioned before, right, that we have this vertical stuff, but we don't have the horizontal anymore. horizontal works fine when it's set normally, but what about in this format? So I'm wondering, I'm curious, does anybody know the property that we'd use to create columns? We've got the rows down fine, but what about columns? Okay, so we're going to use a property called grid template, right? So as the name suggests, we're defining a template of how these columns are going to work. And then we have the option of rows and columns. We also have areas, but that's a much more complex thing that we may not have time to investigate today, but if we do, we'll see how we go for time. Right? But the main two things I want to work through today, and for the majority of your CSS grid needs, will just be columns and rows. That's it, right? You don't need a lot of complexity for this stuff. So in our case, right, we wanted to have these things side by side. So let's work with columns. Now, there's a lot of properties for grid. There's also a lot of values for grid as well. So I'm wondering, does anybody know how to create columns? Very simply. Someone like Lee, you've been doing this for a while, right? What would you suggest we do here? If Lee's mic is not turned on. Sorry to pick on you, mate. He's texting it. I can't see the text. Use FR, he says. FR. We're going to get to FR, but before we do that, I want to keep it simpler. All right. Let's just say 10 pixels. Let's just see what this does. Interesting. So I wonder what's going on here. It looks like we've gone back to this inline grid example, doesn't it? So if we open up our inspector, right, Chrome has this really nice feature where it actually, if you hover over it, it actually shows you the grid, which is pretty cool. I don't know if you guys can see that, those little dotted lines. I'll set this to something a little larger. Let's say 50 pixels. Okay. So it's essentially gone back to this inline grid format, hasn't it? It's not taking up the whole space. So, and it's also only got one column, which we don't want. So I wonder if we did something else, right? What if we said 50 pixels, 50 pixels? So now we're starting to see the relationship between the value that we put in here in the template and how the template is applied on the grid. So as we'd expect, if we put in 4 values, you would expect 4 columns. So now it's starting to form a little bit more of a basis of what we were originally looking for, isn't it? We've got 4 columns. In fact, we've got 5 on this. Sorry, 4 by 5. I think in this case, we're missing out these numbers. Sorry, these operators. So let's add those underneath. All right, we have a button with a divide by symbol. I don't know how to get that on Mac. Let's just do it. We've got a multiply. We've got a addition. We've got a subtraction. And we've also got an equals. And we've also got some of these other things. We've got a 0. So bring our 0 back down the bottom, just to follow this design. And then we've also got a dot, or a period. Right? And we'll just forget about these for now. Right. Okay, so we're starting to see how this resembles it, but do we really want to write? Is there a better way of doing this? I'm wondering what other values we could put inside here. Anybody have any ideas? So Lee mentioned this thing called FR. I'm about to get to that. I'm going to comment this out. Let's call this method 1, or way 1. Right? Let's introduce another method, method 2. Method 2. What if we use percentages? Right, if we've got 4 columns, right, 25% each. I wonder if this will do the same thing. Interesting. So we know that the display grid is greedy in that it takes up all the width display block. And now these 25%, right? It's now expanding out to the full width of its potential, right? At 25% each. So what if we set one of them to say something larger, like 50? What happens here? Interesting. So it's actually gone over the top. Right, this 3 being the double the normal ones. So I'm wondering if there's a more efficient way. This is a useful thing, and we can actually combine these together. For example, let's turn this 50 into 50 pixels. Okay. So we've got 25% for the first 2, 50% for this one, and then 25% for the last one. So we can actually start to combine these things together. Now, you can obviously use other normal CSS values like rem, for example, 2rem. Right, we'll equal that width. Right, we might have what's something else like a view width, right? 10 view width, which is 10 units of the width of the browser. Right. So as we expand, we would expect that also to expand out. Okay. So we're starting to see how this can become pretty powerful. But we don't want different different values for each one, because on our calculator example, they're all the same. So I'm going to leave that here, right, for our notes, and let's introduce a new way. Right, this is what Lee was talking about. There's this concept called FR. Now, what do we think FR stands for? Any ideas on this? If you're texting on the channel, I can't actually see because so if you turn your mic on, I can hear.
Fraction?
That's right. It stands for fraction. Fraction of what? Fraction of what?
The container?
The container, right? So is it relative to the size of the container? So if I put 1 FR, what's that going to do? 1 FR. Is it out of 100 FR? Is it like our view width over here? That 100 view width is the complete width of the page, and 100 VH is 100 height of the page, or is it something else? Well, let's have a look. Let's refresh the page. Interesting. So we've gone back to, if I comment it out, it looks to be that this is the default. I'm refreshing and there's no change here. What if we set 100 VR? Okay, no change. 1,000, 1,000,000, no change. So what does this tell us? Well, right now it doesn't tell us much. So why don't we try and play with it? Why don't we have 1 FR and then have 100 FR as a second column? Let's see what this does. Interesting. So it looks to be that it's taking the relative space between them. It's saying that this is a ratio, saying this is 100 to 1. All right, so this 2 is 100 times the size, width-wise, of the 1. I'm curious, what happens if we start to mix things together? How does it determine the ratio if something is a percentage? So if we have, say, another column of 50 pixels, it just scales it. So what the FR does is it takes the available remaining space. So it calculates the hard fixed values like pixels and rems, then and the view widths, right? Then it also, so that's the first step. Then the second step is it calculates the percentages. And then the last step is it calculates the remaining available space. And it divides all of this up. So let's use an extreme example. Let's say 50% is the first column. Then we have 100 pixels. Right? Then we have, let's say 1 FR, 1 FR. Like this. So the first one's always going to take up 50%. This one's always going to take up 100 pixels. And then whatever's left over gets divided up. So in this case, 1 plus 1 is 2, right? And each one of them is 1. Therefore, each one of them is 50% of the remaining space. If we set one of them to say 2, right? 1 plus 2 is 3. Now the total units available for this space in between here is now 3. So it divides these up. Now, of course, these columns could be placed anywhere. It doesn't matter where they're placed. It's about that. It's about the order in which they're calculated. So in this case, the 3, right, should be twice as large as the 4. And we can see this if we hover over this, right? 156 by 78. So that's double that width. So now we're starting to see how these things can become very very powerful, very complex, as we start to explore different visual layout systems. It becomes very dynamic, very, very powerful. So let's leave this for now. Did anybody have any questions before I continue on anything that we've covered so far? This is a pretty powerful framework to wrap your head around. So I really encourage you guys to jump out and get involved asking questions with this, because the best way to learn is to ask. Okay, so right, what should we do next? We kind of proven this idea of the calculator. So why don't we jump onto a maybe a little bit more of a complex demo? Okay. Call this calculator. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this file. Call this calculator. Why don't we try a different format? Let's try the very common blog layout that we see here, right? We've got some kind of header, sidebar that usually extends down, and we've got some main body section, right? Very, very common. In fact, I'm using this on my own blog, right? Having some kind of, well, in this case I don't have a header, but sidebar, some kind of main content. This is a very common format to see across many different things. So how would we accomplish this in the grid? Well, let's call this, say, article, following the article format. Article format. Okay, so let's define what we've got from a HTML perspective. So we usually have a header. Usually have a logo inside that header. So just call this image. Source is, say, placehold. It say 400 by 200. Right. It's an X. We usually have like a, yeah, it's fine for a logo. And we have the aside as a sidebar. And then typically you have a nav, and then a list of items on that nav. Right. So let's open this up. And then you'll have your main, right, typically used for the article. Put the heading 1 in there. Right, we'll have some lorem ipsum. Right. Just duplicate this over a couple of times. Might have an unordered list with some list items times 10. All right. And then maybe you have a footer down the bottom. The footer might have, we'll just reuse that logo. This is a very common HTML structure. I'll post this inside Slack if you guys want to use this. I'll also post it on here for you guys as well. Apologies if the formatting doesn't work exactly on that. Let's put this under, where should we put this? Let's put this under front-end beginners. So if you want to join the channel, you can just click on plus, browse channels, all right, and then just type front-end beginners, and it will show up here. There you go. Okay, so that's pretty much all we need from a HTML perspective. How do we get this looking good? Just keep in mind that I forgot to add that. There we go. It's probably a little bit too large. Let's say 200 by 100. There we go. Maybe even 50. Okay, so how do we go from this ugly looking document into the format that we see here, at the side and the header and the footer down the bottom? How do we do this with Grid? I'm going to actually add another constraint as well. So in this case, right, the footer is it only sits down the bottom when we scroll down there. But for the purpose of today, I'm going to create a situation where we have the sidebar on the side, the header is always there, and the footer will also always be there. It's going to be like a sticky header, sidebar, and footer example. So we'll only really be scrolling on the main element. So how do we do this? Okay, so I want to remove this. Now, from the HTML structure that we've got here, who can tell me what element I'm going to add display grid on this HTML structure? Any guesses?
The body, maybe?
Exactly, on the body, because it incorporates all of the direct elements that we're working with. There's no wrappers or anything like that. So let's go ahead and add that in. Display grid. Okay, so it doesn't change anything. So let's go ahead and add our columns. All right, so in this case, we might have a, let's say 30%, right, and then 70% for the main as the columns. So grid template columns, let's say 30%, right, and let's just say 1 FR to take up the remaining space. Let's see what happens. Okay, so it's kind of working. All right, let's have a look here inside our inspector. Let's hover over this. So we can actually see that Chrome is highlighting the space for us. You guys can see these purple lines, right? So what's the problem here? Can anybody tell me what the issue is? I have to highlight more specifically. On the side, I'm going to give it a background, a slight background color. All right, who can see what the problem is? Any guesses?
I think it's separate by the parent container.
Separate the parent container?
Yeah, like header aside something like that.
What do you mean by separate them? Because they are separate in
Yeah.
HTML. What's the issue? Like forget about the code for a second. What's the issue that we've got? What do we want?
The
Things-
header. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Zoe.
We do this all the time with
Yeah.
us. Things just aren't where you want them to be.
All right, sounds like a midlife crisis. So, or when my wife goes and looks in the pantry, she says the same thing. So how do we fix this? What do we do? Right? What if we say things aren't where they're supposed to be? Right? Let's chunk down into this specifically. What's the problem here? Right?
We haven't told
Right.
the computer where we want it to go is the problem.
But what specifically? Told
The right
told,
column is takes up too much space.
So the spacing is actually defined in the grid, and the spacing is fine, right? So the 30% and the 1FR, that's fine. That's what we want. But what's the issue here, right? The header is only taking up one column. How do we fix this? Because we do want these two columns. That's correct. We don't want to add an extra sub item right in between here where we've got a sub grid with, you know, this is the grid here, right? No, we want it to be across everything. So what do we do? How do we make this header element, right, stretch out to be the full width? Any ideas? Well, let me introduce a new concept to you guys. Okay, so we're going to target the header, and we're going to go grid column. Okay, so grid column on a particular element allows us to change where it sits on the grid without adjusting at all the HTML structure, at all. So for example, let's set the header to 2, column 2, and let's see what happens. Interesting. So if we hover over this, we can see that the first column, first row, right, A1, if you will, to use an Excel metaphor, is completely blank. That's because there's nothing that actually precedes the header. There's nothing in here. This is a blank space. And we forced the header to be on the column 2. So essentially, it's pushed everything over. So if we toggle this on and off, you guys will see what I mean. Right? So it's pushed the article, or the aside, sorry, onto the next row, because we've only defined 2 rows. And this happens to be the right place for the sidebar. This is also the right place for the article. This is also the right place for the footer. However, we have the same problem in that it's not taking up the full width. All right, so let's illustrate this a little further. Set this to, say, a dark gray. So we want this footer to take up the whole width. So what do we do here? Well, rather than setting the column exactly, Grid allows us to specify something a little bit more advanced. Instead of saying just set it to 2, we can actually use a feature called span. Not the same as a HTML span, so don't confuse the two. Now span says how many columns or rows, because you can also do this with grid row, how many columns would you like this to span over? In our case, it's 2. So let's set this to span 2 and refresh the page. And we'll also add a background. Okay, Now it seems to be working. So if we hover over our header, it seems to be correct. So before we continue, do we have any questions on anything we've covered so far, on grid, how span works, columns work? We haven't touched rows yet.
I was going to ask about rows. Could they also do the same thing with the span?
They
for grid row?
sure can. Let's have a look. Let's set the header to grid column span 2 and grid row span 2. Let's see what this looks like. Well, absolutely nothing. All right, let's turn off the column. Now that's cool. There's a lot of things that have happened just here. So what's happening is the header, I don't know if you guys can see these grid lines. The header is taking up both rows, because we've specified it. We said grid span 2 on the row. And it's forcing, because there's available space now, it's forcing all these other guys into the second column. And then the footer, because there's nothing left, the footer just wraps back onto the first column again. If we said span 3, like the footer would also be on the right-hand side, because we set the header to be greedy, to take up all that space. So,
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Trishan. Andrew is asking on the chat if
Yeah.
you can increase the font.
oh, on the code or the?
I'm
The code,
not
please.
sure.
Is that better?
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. So this is how rows and columns can actually work together. You get some pretty cool results. I'll give you another tip. Right, you know how we use the grid column with a number without the span to move it over? Right, what happens if we set on the footer, for example, grid row 1? Wow, lots of things. I'm going to take off that grid row on the header for a second. Look at that. We've got a header and footer right next to each other. What if we say grid on the footer, again, column, span 2? So we forced it. Let's just set it to red so you can differentiate. So the footer, we've forced onto the first row, and we've also forced it to take up 2 columns. So regardless of where it sits in our HTML, which is all the way down the bottom here, we can actually move it around with CSS. So who's starting to see the advantages of why you would want to use CSS Grid? Maybe how you could use this inside responsive layouts.
So this is not a full replacement of the div. This is just for when you want it to align, right?
This doesn't replace divs at all. Divs are just a HTML element to, that's what div stands for, divider, to divide up your content. And then what you can use is you use grid over your divs or your other elements. You can use it for over anything. Grid is completely agnostic to whatever element you want to use, as with most of CSS. So you can use, as in this case, we're using header, the aside, we're using a main, a footer. You could easily add a div in here. You can do whatever you want. But the grid allows you to be the HTML to be agnostic to where it's placed. So you can get very fine-grained control on moving things around without changing a lick of HTML. It's all done through through CSS Grid, which is pretty powerful.
Tristan, I have a question about when you changed the header, you had the grid column span 2 and you added grid row span 3. So I know that there are shortcuts to doing the column and the row together, but how come when you did them both, that one, you couldn't do them both at the same time? Like, I had expected span 2 would take over 2, and then span 3 would go 3 down as well. Like, it would do both of them.
We actually can. It's because we're only running 2 columns. It's not very evident. Let's go back to our calculator example, and I will show you, because that's a good question, and it's good to clarify. Excuse me. So let's select 4 or say 3 as an example. I'm glad you asked this. So let's say example, right? Span. Well, as a short example, right? We can say grid column 1 and grid row, say 7. All right, now 7 doesn't obviously exist, but it just puts it down the bottom that you see here. Okay, so that's a simple example. Let's use your example, which I think is what you're asking, which is combining the 2 together. So grid span 2. Sorry, grid column span 2. Grid row span 2. Let's move the example to the number 2, so it's a bit more in the middle. All right, span 4. You see how it's pushing everything down? So 1, 2, 3. All right. It's a very powerful framework to use, because we can get very, very specific with how we want certain elements to play out. Does that answer your question? I think it was Zoe who was answering.
Yeah, it does. It just, you're right. On the previous example, there just weren't enough columns. That's why.
There wasn't
behaving.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's set this back down to something like 4. There you go. I'm going to leave this example as it is. It's ugly as hell, but it just kind of illustrates what we're talking about there. This also needs a method 3. Okay, so going back to our article example, all right, let's go back to some of the originals. Okay, and then on the header, span 2. Okay, and then also on the footer, right, so grid column, span 2. Okay, so all the stuff that we did with rows, with column sizing, can also be done with rows. So for example, let's make each of these rows exactly the same width. So we say grid template rows, and let's say 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. So the total is 3, and each of them is divided by that. So we'll have equidistant or equisized rows, which might look a little funny. Okay, it does. Let's add a little bit more of a background to that footer. Don't judge me on my color choices today, team. It's more just for illustration purposes. And it also makes it easy for you guys to see. Okay, so all these rows are actually the same size. So this is pretty cool, because now we're starting to see how we're combining the template columns and rows together. right? So why don't we do something a little bit more dynamic or friendly than this? Also, in this example team, you can also go repeat. If you don't want to type all that out, so you have 20 columns, you can go repeat the number of times you want to repeat it. In this case, it's 3, comma, like this. So that actually does the same thing. And you can actually get more fancy with this with combining, like say 1FR, and then say you want to have a space of 10 pixels. We haven't got into grid gap yet. We might actually have to cover part 2 of this tutorial because I'm realizing that we're running out of time today. And we're only covering some of the basics. So I don't think we have anything planned for next week. So would you guys be interested in doing this next week for a part 2? There's still a lot of things I want to cover with you guys.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, great. Only if it's useful. I just want to get a sense of where everyone's at. And don't just say yes because I'm asking. I'm actually genuinely curious. Where people are cool. Enough people saying yes. So let's do that. I'm gonna push this up on GitHub for you. So just so you guys can have a play with it yourself. Get in it. And we go into our code mentoring GitHub. For those who are not aware of the code mentoring that we have, come and check this out. We've got some good stuff here. I'll post a link. Where are we? Here. So I'll be putting this under probably webinar CSS Grid. Right. Exploration. Into the CSS Grid. That'll be public. Okay, copy over the URL. GitHub changed their icons recently. It's very disorientating. Huh. It didn't seem to work. I wonder why. Yeah, that seems to be the right place. Oh, for some reason I can't push to Git, which is... Oh, I probably have to add it first. Yeah. Okay, so this should all be up on GitHub for you guys to peruse in your leisure. There you go. Again, I'll just post a link to that. And that, I suppose we should probably hand it over to you guys for questions now. I'm going to stop presenting and turn off the recording. Well, thanks, YouTube. See you next week on YouTube.